Rome did not build its empire on courage alone. Its real power was debt. Today, we imagine those magnificent legions as unstoppable warriors, shaped by honor and discipline. But behind those shining helmets and sharp gladii, there was an unbelievably complex and incredibly expensive supply system. The food, weapons, roads, and salaries of thousands of people had to be provided. Horses required feed. Catapults, towers, and battering rams needed wood, iron, and labor. All of these things ran on money, a lot of money. So how did Rome finance its centuries-long conquests? And why does this still matter? Because when we look inside Rome's war machine, a pattern appears. War wasn't only fought on the battlefield. It was woven into the backbone of the financial system. And once this system gained momentum, stopping it became nearly impossible. Growth was no longer a desire, it had become an economic necessity. Does this sound familiar? Let's go back to the very beginning. In the early Republic, Rome's army was a citizen army. Anyone who owned land could be called to serve. Soldiers brought their own weapons and returned to their fields once the campaign ended. But as Rome's borders expanded, wars grew longer and were fought in distant lands. This old system began to crack. You could no longer grab a spear and fight for a year. Professional soldiers were needed. So Rome centralized military financing under state control. Soldiers began receiving small but regular payments, not much but enough to maintain loyalty. Then came the Great Transformation. Conquest turned directly into a revenue model. Every new province meant new taxes, new slaves, new mines, and new tributes. The machine fed itself. War financed more war. But the most interesting and dangerous part comes after this. Rome didn't rely on taxes alone. It borrowed heavily. Especially during long and costly periods like the Punic Wars against Carthage, the Republic took massive public loans from wealthy elites, particularly from the rapidly rising equities class. These were not patriotic donations, they were investment contracts in the modern sense. Investors expected returns, interest payments, tax collection privileges, and near-monopoly trade rights in newly conquered regions. Thus, war became a direct economic sector. The more profit it created, the more wars Rome fought. Sound familiar? Over time, this militarized economy shaped everything. Power shifted to generals who could promise plunder. Senators behaved like shareholders of violence. Private contractors called publicani handled everything from logistics to tax collection, making fortunes along the way. A toga-wearing form of military-industrial capitalism emerged, and the costs, they piled up every year. The state constantly needed new resources to pay soldiers and satisfy creditors. When conquests slowed or rebellions drained the treasury, Rome turned to the oldest trick in history, debasing the currency. Under Nero, the silver content of the denarius was quietly reduced. For the next 2 centuries, emperors continued this debasement. A coin that was once real silver slowly became an empty promise. The result: inflation, loss of trust. By the 3rd century, the monetary system was on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, the rich grew even richer. Senators and equities stored their wealth in land, slaves, and assets in outer provinces. The poor paid taxes with money that lost value each year, while the elite enjoyed exemptions and insider deals. Public services collapsed. Corruption exploded. The financial burden of endless wars fell on the lowest classes. Through inflation, forced labor, and heavier military obligations, it wasn't only the army that was breaking. The monetary order was collapsing. Now pause and look at today. Massive budget deficits. Wars financed by debt. Central banks quietly eroding currency value to cover gaps. Financial circles making fortunes from defense contracts in crises. An economy that needs constant growth, whether military, monetary, or market-based, just to stay standing. Not identical, of course. But the DNA of the pattern feels strangely familiar. Rome teaches us this: an economy built on constant expansion, especially one fed by violence, eventually hits a wall. There are no more lands to conquer, no more resources to seize, no more enemies to defeat. At that point, the system turns inward. The debt remains. The expectations remain, but the income stops. That's when the state begins squeezing its own people. Rome turned to heavier taxes, more currency debasement, more control, bread and circuses to distract the masses, fortified villas for the rich. Sound familiar? Today we don't call it tribute. We call it taxes, monetary expansion, or economic policy. But the workings are eerily similar. Central banks print money. Governments spend more than they earn. The rich buy assets. The poor go grocery shopping with shrinking wages. Wars are still funded by debt. The United States war in Afghanistan cost $2 trillion, most of it financed through borrowing. And who received the contracts? Who collected the interest? Who paid the price through inflation, cuts in public services, and weakened currency? You already know the answer. And just like in Rome, the cycle repeats itself. Once debt becomes a habit, you don't need a disaster to print money. Postponing collapse is enough. The extraordinary becomes normal. And the longer this continues, the more the system must insist that everything is fine, until the lie no longer works. This is why economic history matters. These are not dusty pages, they are warning signs. When we look at Rome, we see a state that handed too much power to private financial interests, became dependent on expansion, rotted its own currency from within, and eventually crushed its citizens under an unsustainable burden. Not because it was evil, but because the system had no stop button. Today, we live in a different kind of empire. Digital, global, fueled by capital flow. But the game is the same. Money moves with power. War is still profitable. Inflation still crushes the weak. And financial illusions always work, until they don't. So what can you do? Start by recognizing the pattern, because most people cannot. They think inflation is an accident. They believe taxes are unavoidable. They assume debt is freedom. They imagine growth can be infinite. The Stoics had a name for this: illusion. You cannot escape the system entirely, but you can understand it. You can stop playing blindly. You can build your own resilience, not just with money, but with perspective. That begins by studying financial history, not just personal finance. By tracking the signs of systemic pressure, not just market excitement. By asking, who gains when I don't understand? Because you were never supposed to know these things. You weren't supposed to question how Rome financed its wars. You weren't supposed to wonder what modern states are doing today. You were expected to focus on headlines, growth numbers, and glamorous displays, not mechanisms, not incentives, but now you know. And once you learn, there's no going back. Financial literacy isn't just about budgeting or investment planning. It's about understanding power, about decoding systems, about seeing through the illusion of stability. So next time you hear about a new war, a new stimulus package, or a new crisis, don't just watch. Follow the money. Ask who is lending, who is earning, and who pays the bill in the end. Because history teaches us one undeniable truth. Empires collapse not when their gates fall, but when the math stops working. and no one dares to fix it. If this gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe.